For a moment, the studio goes completely quiet. Not the polite kind of quiet you expect on a daytime talk show, but the kind where you can feel the tension hanging in the air. Bruce Willis leans slightly forward in his chair, eyes fixed across the table, while Sunny Hostin looks back at him, clearly surprised by what he just said. Quick heads up, subscribe to Backstory Uncovered, because what starts as a normal conversation here is about to take a turn no one expected. The segment had started off like dozens before it. Bruce Willis was on the show to talk about his legacy in Hollywood, a few stories from his career, and some reflections on action movies that defined the 90s. The audience had been warm from the beginning, cheering when he walked out, laughing at a couple of his early jokes. Bruce seemed relaxed, even playful. Sunny Hostin smiled as she began the discussion. "Bruce, you've had one of the most recognizable careers in Hollywood," she said, glancing down briefly at her notes before looking back up. "But lately there's been a lot of conversation about how action films shaped a certain kind of culture. Some critics say they glorified violence in ways we're still unpacking today." Bruce nodded slowly, listening. Sunny continued, "When you look back at movies like Die Hard and others that followed, do you ever wonder if that kind of storytelling had unintended consequences?" The audience murmured lightly. It wasn't an aggressive question, but it carried weight. Bruce leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. "Well," he said calmly, "I think people sometimes forget that movies are stories. They're not instruction manuals." A few people in the audience chuckled. Sunny tilted her head, still smiling but clearly pressing forward. "Sure," she replied, "but stories influence culture, don't they? I mean, when audiences see certain types of heroes solving problems a certain way over and over again, it shapes expectations." Bruce nodded again, but this time his expression shifted, just slightly. "Maybe," he said. "But I think audiences are a lot smarter than we give them credit for." There was a brief pause. Sunny leaned forward. "So you don't think there's any responsibility on the part of actors or filmmakers when it comes to the messages those stories send?" Bruce let out a small breath through his nose, almost like a quiet laugh. "Well, responsibility is a big word." A few audience members chuckled again, but the mood was starting to tighten. Sunny pressed a little further. "I'm just asking because some actors today are becoming more vocal about the social impact of their work. Looking back, do you feel like that conversation should have happened earlier in Hollywood?" Bruce's eyes narrowed just a bit, not in anger, but in focus. "Sunny," he said slowly, "when we made those movies, we were trying to entertain people. That was the job." The audience clapped lightly. Sunny raised a hand gently, cutting in before the applause fully settled. "Of course, but entertainment and influence aren't mutually exclusive." Bruce nodded again. "True," he said. "But influence goes both ways." That line got a louder reaction from the audience. Sunny paused, studying him for a moment. "What do you mean by that?" Bruce leaned forward now, resting his elbows lightly on his knees. "I mean, audiences choose what they connect with. They're not passive. They're part of the conversation." There was another pause. Sunny opened her mouth to respond, but stopped for a split second, clearly thinking about how to frame her next question. "Let me ask it this way," she said carefully. "Do you think actors sometimes avoid accountability by saying they're just entertainers?" The room shifted again. A few people in the audience murmured. Bruce blinked once, then leaned back in his chair again. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Sunny waited. The audience waited. And when Bruce finally spoke again, his tone had changed, still calm, but noticeably firmer. "Accountability for what, exactly?" The question landed heavier than anyone expected. Sunny blinked. "Well..." But Bruce raised a hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to pause the moment. "I'm genuinely asking," he said. "Accountability for telling a story people chose to watch?" A few audience members clapped. Sunny tried to jump back in. "No one's saying..." But Bruce continued, still measured, still controlled. "Because if we're talking about accountability," he said, "then we should probably talk about the whole ecosystem. Studios, media, audiences. Not just the guy who said a line on screen." Now the applause was louder. Sunny's expression shifted from confident to slightly tense. She leaned forward again. "Bruce, with respect." And that's when the conversation took a turn no one in the room seemed ready for. Sunny took a small breath before continuing, clearly aware the room had shifted. "Bruce, with respect," she said, leaning forward again, "no one is blaming actors for everything. But when someone has the level of influence you've had for decades, people are naturally going to ask questions about responsibility." Bruce didn't interrupt this time. He just watched her carefully. The audience was quiet again. Sunny continued, her tone steady but firmer than before. "You've been part of some of the most iconic films ever made. Millions of people grew up watching those characters. So the question isn't about blame, it's about reflection. Looking back now, do you think Hollywood could have been more thoughtful about what it was putting out into the world?" Bruce nodded slowly. For a second, it looked like he might simply give a diplomatic answer and move on. But instead, he leaned forward again, resting his hands together. "Sunny," he said calmly, "I've reflected plenty." There was a short pause. "And here's what I've learned." The room felt even quieter now. "When people talk about those movies today," Bruce continued, "they talk about explosions and fights. But what most fans actually remember is the character." A few people in the audience nodded. "They remember John McClane bleeding, struggling, barely getting through the night," he said. "He wasn't some perfect superhero. He was a guy trying to survive." Sunny listened, arms now loosely crossed. Bruce kept going. "And that's what connected with people. Not the violence. The humanity." A small wave of applause moved through the audience. Sunny uncrossed her arms and leaned in again. "But Bruce, some critics argue that audiences don't always separate those things. They see the hero win through violence and that becomes the takeaway." Bruce smiled slightly, not mocking, but knowing. "Critics analyze movies," he said. "Audiences experience them." That line pulled a louder reaction from the crowd. Sunny raised a hand again, trying to keep the conversation balanced. "But you can't deny culture evolves," she replied. "What audiences celebrated 30 years ago might look different today." Bruce nodded immediately. "You're right." Sunny blinked, slightly surprised by the quick agreement. "You are," Bruce repeated. "Culture evolves. That's healthy." He leaned back in his chair again. "But what worries me," he continued, "is when we start rewriting the past as if people back then didn't understand what they were watching." A few people clapped again. Sunny tilted her head. "So you think the criticism is unfair?" Bruce paused for a moment before answering. "I think sometimes," he said carefully, "we underestimate people." He gestured lightly toward the audience. "These folks didn't watch those movies and suddenly decide violence was the answer to life. They watched because they wanted a good story." The audience laughed and clapped again. Sunny opened her mouth to respond, but Bruce added one more sentence, quietly. "And maybe a little escape from real life." That line shifted the mood again. It wasn't confrontational. It was honest. For the first time since the tension began, Sunny's expression softened. She nodded slowly. "I can respect that perspective," she said. The audience applauded. But Bruce wasn't quite finished. He leaned forward one last time. "And if we're talking about responsibility," he added, his voice steady, "maybe the real responsibility is making sure stories still allow people to feel something, instead of turning every conversation into a courtroom." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the studio audience erupted in applause. Some people even stood. Sunny laughed lightly, shaking her head as the reaction continued. "Well," she said with a half-smile, "I guess you just silenced the room." Bruce shrugged casually. "I was just answering the question." The audience laughed again. Sunny looked toward the cameras. "And that," she said, still smiling, "is why live television can be unpredictable." Bruce leaned back comfortably now, the tension clearly broken. The conversation moved on shortly after, but the moment had already landed. What started as a routine discussion about Hollywood history had turned into something far more intense and far more memorable. Some viewers would say Sunny raised fair questions. Others would say Bruce delivered a masterclass in staying calm under pressure. But one thing was certain. For a few minutes on live television, the entire studio stopped talking and listened. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Bruce Willis handled that exchange the right way, or do you think Sunny Hostin's questions were fair? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Backstory Uncovered for more moments like this.